Tonight's presentation, Diné History, Colonial Archives, and Oral History, will focus on historical photographs of Diné as subjects and explore the workings of colonial archives and how primary sources, such as photographs, shape how we know people and places, thereby reinforcing stereotypes that have been resonated across decades. Simultaneously, these same photographs become the vehicle for renewed storytelling for Diné. What might we learn, if anything, about Diné from photographs? What might photographs tell us about Diné history? How do photographs become a site for renewed storytelling? Jennifer Diné is a professor and chair of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She is best known for her book, Reclaiming Diné History, The Legacies of Navajo Chief Manuelito and Juanita, and has published 2 Navajo histories for young adults and a children's book. She is the author of numerous book chapters and journal essays. Her research is focused on Diné studies with attention to history, gender and sexuality, and theories of settler colonialism and decolonization. She co-curated 2 museum exhibitions of Milton Snow's photographs, one at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology, 2025-26, and the Navajo Nation Museum, which opened August 8th of 2025. She is the co-author of a forthcoming book on Milton Snow photographs that are largely from the Navajo Nation Museum's collection, which will be published in October 2026 by the University of New Mexico Press. She is from Tohatchi, New Mexico, on the Navajo Nation, and currently resides in Albuquerque. Now, please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thank you for this invitation, and thank you for bringing a cold winter evening to come and share this evening with me. I'm very grateful to be here, and I want to thank my son, Shiaj Nicholas Diné, and Shanale Tyler for accompanying me. I'm also happy to see familiar faces in the audience, including former President Robert Martin and my former professor, Lucy Tabahanzo, my very good friend and dissertation advisor, James Ferris. And so those are some of the people that came out to see me, and I'm really, to hear this talk, and I'm very grateful for this. So thank you very much. She Jennifer Diné Dale, and she Logan Schlo, Ashi Bashishi, Kitlichi, Dashiche, Toha Glini, Dashinala, but I at the nest on the Tohachi, I see that Nasha. So I just introduced myself in the proper Diné woman way. I have spent probably more than 40 years now, maybe 40 years in archives. And I particularly became fascinated with photographs because of the way in which history is constructed, the way in which Diné experiences historically are often sanitized. There's denial. And so I had to work through the colonial archives against the kinds of narratives that are fueled, national narratives that are settler histories that are fueled. And so it's always been my job as a historian to work through that and to think about how Navajo and how Indigenous people think about their experiences historically. And so that's always been my work. And so this is not the title of this talk, but I didn't know how to change it. But it's along the same line. So what I wanted to start with is the 2 museum exhibitions that I co-curated. Over the years, I had been consulted. I served as a consultant for various museums throughout the country. I wrote essays for museum catalogs. I was a consultant, and I visited archives throughout this country for more than 40 years. And so all that experience and all this work that I had put into making history with my primary audience being my own people, really came to a really wonderful place when I was invited to, first I was a consultant for Nothing Left for Me exhibition at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology, and then this collaborative project with the Navajo Nation Museum, which was generously funded by the Luce Foundation and facilitated by the Native Nations Development Institute, which served as my fiscal agent. So this photograph that I'm sharing here is the opening panel when you go into the Navajo Nation Museum. I learned so much of museum language as I was working through these two projects. So you have, and I learned the lingo, so you have a couple of people here whose job it is to put up vinyls, and I had no idea what vinyls were. Okay, so my manager of my museum, my Navajo Nation Museum project on the Milton Snow photographs, would send these pictures to me as the week before the exhibition opened in Winter Rock. And so it's one of my favorite photographs to see these two young people working on the welcoming panel as you walk into the Navajo Nation Museum. So, and I encourage you to go to the Navajo Nation Museum and see the exhibition. This one here, this is whenever anyone comes through town, comes through town in Albuquerque, I always invited them to go see the exhibition at the Maxwell Museum. And so here, our Navajo Nation Council delegate, Amber Crotty, came to visit me, and she went through the exhibition at the Maxwell Museum. So, history, doing research, for me has always been a collaborative project. It's always been research that was informed not only by my own experiences growing up on the Navajo Nation, but it was experiences of talking to my parents, to my grandparents, to community members, to our leaders, to our elders. And so I really brought that as one of the focus when I was working on the collaborative project with the Navajo Nation Museum. So here at the opening of the Navajo Nation Museum, I have my dear, dear friend Martha Blue, who lives in Flagstaff, and my traditional practitioner friend and colleague, Steve Darden. Steve Darden and I served on the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. I served for 13 years, he served for 16 years. I was chair of the Human Rights Commission for 8 years, and he was my vice chair. So just the wonderful kinds of relationships that I've built in the past 30 years at least has always been collaborative, community-based research. And so I was really happy to bring that together in my project at the Navajo Nation Museum. Martha Blue is actually one of the people who introduced me to Milton Snow's photographs. By doing lectures and presentations on Snow's photographs, you would not, if you had Googled him, you would not have seen hardly any references to him on the internet. There is Will Wilson's dissertation in fine arts at the University of New Mexico, and that's the only long work on Milton Snow. His contemporaries are John Collier Jr., Dorothy Lane, I'm forgetting, Laura Gilpin, and yet he's been relatively unknown up until the point where I began doing this work on Snow's photographs. So Martha, who is a retired lawyer from Diné, which was a Navajo-based legal firm, was the one who really encouraged me to begin working on the Snow photographs as a research project. I was having lunch with her one day in Flagstaff, and she had her manuscripts in folders in front of her, and she told me, she said, Natalie Pattison and I were going to do a biography of Milton Snow. She said, Natalie said, I can't do this anymore, I'm too old. Here, you do it. So then Martha, that afternoon, she slid her research material across the table to me, and she said, I can't do this, I'm too old. You do it. So now at 67, I don't want to be too old to not finish this project. So I'm very grateful for just all the wonderful conversations and relationships that I've had over the span of at least 40 years. Okay, and then this is Shadeen. Jim is the interim director of the, and sorry I picked one where she shut her eyes, she'll be upset with me if she sees this. She's the interim director of the Navajo Nation Museum. My agreement for collaboration really came through Manuelito Wheeler, who is the former director of the Navajo Nation Museum. Steve Darden, who has always provided guidance for me with his ceremonies and prayers and songs. And then Russ Hartman came to the official opening. I was really pleased to meet him. He was the tribal director of the Navajo Tribal, that time was the Tribal Museum in the 1980s and the 1990s, you know. And so he published one essay on the Navajo Tribal Museum, which is published in Kiva, and I think it's, I can't remember the date, might be 1980s. But he talks about the way the Navajo Tribal Museum's collection really comes about and the thought about what museum spaces are in very much the same way that you see the emergence of museums along the lines of anthropology, okay, and collections. And so he writes about that, and he then moves into, talks about the collections that the Navajo Nation holds, and that I think right now the Navajo Nation Museum is really a place for public education. And so it was wonderful to talk to him, and Russ, in an interview with Lilia McGaney, my project manager, my co-editor of the forthcoming Snow manuscript, we interviewed Russ Hartman, and he did two exhibitions of Snow's photographs, you know, and that one of them was primarily, he says, I just put up pictures and Navajo people came by and identified them. Okay? And that was like in the late 80s and early 90s. So this is, I will take people through, I'll get inquiries saying, you know, can you meet us at the museum? Can you take us, give us a tour? And so this is a tour of young Navajo native people, including Navajos, Pueblos, came through. And one of the things that when I take young people through the exhibition, I ask them questions and ask them to imagine, think about what kinds of skills and talents do you think it took to put this exhibition together? It took a historian, it took a filmmaker, it took a photographer, it took a museum collector, it took a museum education person, it took traditional practitioners, it took community-based Navajo people to inform the way in which I think about my visual presentations. And so I really encourage them to think creatively about the usefulness of the humanities. And I always take our pictures when I take them through. So this is a picture of young people coming to visit with me at the Maxwell Museum in Albuquerque. The museum, the Navajo Nation Museum project with Milton Snow photographs, when Manuelito Wheeler agreed to having me curate it. I'm a historian, the paper academic kind, but I've always used Navajo sources such as oral traditions, such as oral history and storytelling as an avenue, as a way to get at indigenous and Diné experiences. And so when I was exploring museums and how to put together an exhibition I called National Museums, and they would tell me something like, oh yeah, a good exhibition takes at least 2 years, and a good exhibition costs us over $150,000. And I'm just like, wow, okay. So once I got funding from the Lewis Foundation, I put together Team Milton Snow. So I have Clarinda Begay, who I invited to be my co-curator for the Navajo Nation exhibition. And then Clara Kelly we call her the walking encyclopedia of the Navajo Nation. She is an ethnoarchaeologist. She's worked with Navajo people for over 40 years. There isn't anything that she doesn't know about Navajo land and all these places on Navajo. I once had the opportunity of driving through Navajo land with her and her pointing out things that you wouldn't even know were there. Okay. And then my program manager and now co-editor, Lilia McAney, who's a museum consultant here in Santa Fe, and she's now an assistant professor at IAIA. We've just worked so well together, and I'm really pleased that she really keeps me together. And then here we are, because we're going back and forth, we're talking to community people, we're talking to established scholars like Clara Kelly, and then we're going into the archives, and this one is the Snow Archives over at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And you know, when your archivists and historians' favorite horror stories are one that Martha Blue tells when she says, those suitcases that Milton Snow left in the 80s sat there on the library floor for over 30 years, and then you just shudder like, oh my God, you know. So Martha and Natalie were the first ones who started going through the Snow suitcases and started putting together the archives. So the Museum of Northern Arizona owns the collection that Snow bequeathed them, including his paper documents. The Navajo Nation holds over 15,000 of Snow's photographs. Okay, it's the largest collection. One of my consultants was Kenji Kawanho. He is Japanese. He's a photographer of Navajo people, primarily the code talkers. And I asked him to be on my team because I know that he has a really good sense about photographs. He has experience reading them. You can't see it here, but after one of our work sessions at the Navajo Nation Museum, he invited us over to his home and he made sushi for us. Okay, so I started out with this photograph. This is actually a photograph that's in the National Archives. The National Archives are holdings. A lot of the photographs there are not attributed to Milton Snow. Okay, but this one is attributed to Milton Snow. And on the back of this photograph, if I remember correctly, because it's been a long time since I went to the Federal Archives in Washington, D.C., but the one on the caption on the back of this photograph says something like, Navajo people looking to the future with the help of Uncle Sam. Okay? And so for Navajo people, looking into the future would be looking eastward, which is the path that the holy people take first thing in the morning. For this caption, they were meaning the forwardness, the future was Western democracy, okay, which is what John Collier, during his reign as U.S. Indian Commissioner, brought to Navajo people, the introduction of Western technologies that was supposed to take the place of the loss of livestock, of sheep, horses, and goats. Okay, so I have some notes here that I wrote, and one of the things I'll say about Western technologies and the introduction of principles of democracy is that American democracies, principles of democracy, are actually anti-indigenous. Okay, and so the introduction, the inculcation of American democratic principles is really about the elimination of indigenous people, the elimination of Diné as Diné. And so I take that kind of framing for the way in which I look at this archive of photographs and all the documents and the histories around and a part of livestock reduction. Of course, you're going to have pictures of sheep, okay? And so there's a lot of pictures of sheep. In the archival documents, in the colonial documents, there are the stories of refusal, there are the stories of reluctance of resistance. But those pretty much don't make it into secondary sources. They don't make it into reports, except as to think about how do they rid themselves of Navajo resistance and Navajo refusal. Okay, but they are there in the archives, and I'm interested in the violence that I do see, that you will see in the colonial archives. One of the collections that I've spent a lot of time with is a sociologist by the name of Solomon Tuthiger Kimball, who left his papers at the Newberry Library in Chicago, Illinois. And in his papers, he offers a chronology of Navajo resistance. Okay? He was sent by Collier to Navajo land so that he could study Navajo resistance, so they could be better able to squash it. One of the things about Snow's photographs is that they are called documentaries, and they're also propaganda. Okay, so one of the things that he did, along with I think he was an educator, last name Lockett, was to produce this booklet called Along the Beale Trail, B-E-A-L-E, and that's reference to one of the first expeditions that comes through Navajo country. You can talk about these early surveys of Navajo land of the Southwest. They're often called exploring parties, expeditions. They're actually scouting for resources, okay? Because it's always about profit. It's always about looking for wealth. And so the earliest reports of Navajo land are about extraction. They are about exploitation. They are about the theft of resources. Okay, it's always been that. Okay, so as documentary and propaganda, then it's part of his task, Snow's photographs task. Snow's task was to photograph before and after photographs, okay, to legitimize the need for Collier's livestock reduction policies. And so this is a picture of, this is what has happened to the land, and it's directly connected to overgrazing by the livestock. Okay, and so that's a common narrative that you find, and these are the kinds of photographs that he took of the land. Okay, so he took he took photographs like this, and he juxtaposed them next to photographs that had been taken earlier by survey to imply that there had been a time when the land had been bountiful. Okay. Some of the things that I've collected, one of them is called the Navajo Problem, and this one is called A Primer of Navajo Economic Problems. One of the things that I see from the 30s, beginning with Collier's interest in Collier's policies, John Collier's policies, is this incredible network of educators, scholars, policymakers, surveyors, engineers, range writers, field nurses, all coming to Navajo, anthropologists too. Anthropologists are just crawling everywhere on Navajo, and all these connections these studies that they produce to address the problem of the Navajo problem. Okay, and the Navajo problem is, how do you bring them into the progress of this country that believes that American democracy is the path for all of its people? Okay, so it was just incredible, and I'm still thinking about all those networks, because those networks of scholars and educators and policymakers, they also had a lot to do with the research. What they produced became the research for the Navajo Land Claims Commission investigation in the 1950s. It also became the fodder for the research for what would become the 1974 Relocation Act, where over 12,000 Navajos were removed from land that had been awarded to the Hopis in northern Arizona. Okay, so there's a lot of connections there. And so when people are reading these, there's a picture, you can see that the last land extension was in 1934, okay, down in the, right under the 1907. So I think a reading of these documents and thinking about the larger picture, because I asked my people to think about what is it from this era, from the 30s into the 50s, that was part of John Collier's policies of democratizing Navajo people, bringing them into the larger fold of American society. What was it exactly was the intention? And I really think the intention when they talk about development and about progress is that they're really talking about expanding capitalism, okay? And recreating whatever else you see in American landscape, okay? In many ways, Navajo was a lab. It was an experimental station, okay? And so you have all these people swarming around with their studies and their ideas of how to bring Navajos down the path of capitalism, and what does it mean and what does it look like. So when I talk about these policies, and I'll give some examples, I want my own people to think about what is it that we live with now that has its roots in Collier's policies of the 30s and 40s. Okay? Here's a picture of Milton Snow. This is a portrait that belongs to the Museum of Northern Arizona. There's another one of the photographs that shows the before and after. Re-educating, transforming a people happens on multiple layers, okay? And so the directive aimed at Navajo people was on multiple layers. Because in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Navajo people were largely illiterate. They didn't write or read the English language, and they didn't speak the Navajo language. And so Milton Snow's work as a photographer was really important to put the government's policies into pictures, into visual images, and to point Navajos in the direction of what they call progress was really important. What was really also important when you think about the development of roads, the development of watering spots, was really to open up lands for extraction, such as the coal mines in northern Arizona, like Peabody Coal. Okay, there's paved roads there. Okay, so you have to think about what the priorities there were in that period. So this is a diorama, and the people think that Navajo tribal fairs are really wonderful. This is where you meet your relatives, you have fun, you have rodeo. The origins of tribal fairs was to educate Navajo people about the wonders of progress. And here, primarily Navajo men, are looking at this diorama of a proposed sawmill. Okay. It also extends to health, it extends to education, it extends to nutrition. So Milton Snow also had created these boards where they would show what they considered a poor diet, okay, which was here, fry bread and coffee, and you can see the child is not smiling, okay? They would juxtapose that with the child smiling, sitting before a piece of fruit and a bowl of oatmeal and a glass of milk, okay? It was also really one of the things when you have the devastation of a way of life, you have the devastation of an economy which was based on livestock, you've got to reintroduce some other way for an economy. And this is really the beginning of a sustained introduction to the wage economy, okay? But for my people, I was just reading this book manuscript. Really good, one of the first comprehensive studies of southern Utah, and talking about the lack of poor infrastructure. The person repeats that 40% of Navajo homes do not have running water. 80% of the roads on Navajo land are not paved. Okay? People who live in Navajo Mountain, Kayenta, they have to drive 200 to 300 miles just for hospital care. Okay, so I asked my students to think about the creation of this infrastructure and the establishment of border towns, because we are dependent on border towns. Okay? Santa Fe is a border town, Albuquerque is a border town, Gallup is my least favorite border town. Okay? So you have these beginnings of the introduction of wage work, and here's one of a work crew. Okay? This is when wages come into Navajo land. The other thing, one of the funnest things that I've had is to look at Window Rock and the administration. And that Window Rock is now the capital of the Navajo Nation. I was thinking, God, I wish I had included a picture of Window Rock, the capital. That was completely designed by John Collier. I think it was 51 units or 52 units. It was completely planned and designed for federal employees. Okay? There's an employees clubhouse, there's tennis courts. Where the president's office was, that was for the top staffers in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The only building in Window Rock that was intended for Navajo people was the Navajo Nation Tribal Council chambers. Okay? So when the federal employees move in to manage Navajo people into Window Rock, Navajo people are living in the periphery. They're the workforce, and they're living in tents, okay, outside of Window Rock. And so the whole creation of the administration to manage it was designed by John Collier. Okay? His failed legislation, the Indian Reorganization Act, failed miserably with Navajo people because they were so outraged about his livestock reduction policies. One of the things that he made sure that he did, which is part of course you guys all know, was the insulation of Navajo men as leaders. Okay, and so here you have one of Snow's photographs of council delegates of this period. It was really hard for me. I'm working on this Navajo Nation government textbook, and just looking at this period from the 1923 into 1934, 1930s and 40s, just the back and forth, the dissolving of the tribal council, the reconstitution, like I was just getting dizzy. And nobody was naming it very clearly for me in all the secondary sources that I was consulting. But that's also something that we continue to find challenging and raise objections about, is the installed patriarchy in Window Rock. Okay? Even today, there's no places for Navajo leadership. There's very little housing. There's 2 hotels there, and that's the design that I think Collier had imagined. Okay. And here's another one, because it also reaches into education. It reaches into concepts of motherhood. This is, again, is at the tribal fair. This is the way they could induce people to come in, and they could share lessons like this mother is happily washing her child, because apparently before these policies we did not know how to clean children, and we did not know how to feed them properly. Okay? And so these are the lessons that are offered through visual images like Snow's of this period. Okay. People, when they study photographs, they often wonder what the relationship was between the photographer and the people. I'm very careful about extractive research, that if you're doing research on my people or indigenous people, you better have established a relationship, and that you aren't just the beneficiary of your research. And so people have often asked, well, what was Milton Snow's relationship with Navajo people? If you just read the photographs, You can see maybe like the comfortableness they had with him, the looks on people's faces. He did train Navajo and Hopi people to be photographers. Ida Gale was one. Gene Price was one. Gene Price came to my opening, the opening of the exhibition at the Maxwell Museum. He had a camera around his neck. Okay, and so the van there, the panel van, that was what he traveled throughout Navajo with. He had a makeshift photography lab inside his van, and then he slept on top. We were talking to Russ Hartman, Lily and I. It's not really clear what kinds of physical elements of what they were named for. There was, like, he stuttered very badly, he had a speech impediment. It was difficult for him to talk. He also shook very badly. Okay, so then Russ Hartman says, given the heaviness of the photography equipment at that time, he was probably more robust than people imagined, you know. But the kinds of pictures, the precision that he took these with, really, I think, belies the kinds of elements that he was dealing with. Okay. So I take this from what was driving Collier's policies. I was really surprised at these conversations that I'm having now, how much Clark Cohn and Layton, Dorothy and Alexander Layton also had in terms of the research for the Land Claims Commission. You know, that research keeps getting recycled over and over, and I just find it fascinating, and I haven't spent enough time to start creating this genealogy. I have no idea what this is. I couldn't read it to you, but these are the kinds of things that I find in the archives, and my eyes just rolled to the back of my head. I have no clue about these sustainability studies. I don't know who made them up or how they made them up. Okay? But they were used as proof for the need for livestock reduction, okay? And restoring the land and putting in place all of these policies. We have at both exhibitions, the Maxwell Museum when closed, a place where people can leave their comments, and this is one comment by someone, said it's cool to learn new history. Okay? And so for me, these places, in terms of what's in the archives, how it conforms to national narratives, and then the spots and the places where you find the refusals and the resistance, to me, is always important. And you find those in the oral histories, you find them in the storytelling, in the collective memory, and those are places for me to be re-inspired to think about the power of storytelling and the power of oral history and oral traditions. Okay. What is this? Oh, so one of the things, this is a panel, part of the panel that, this was the font on this one was too small, so we had to redo the panel, so I took these home. But one of the things that have come out of this model based on the democratic principles is the idea of the nuclear family. So when they began to divide up the land into these districts, 18 land management districts, today those land management districts are still how land use is determined on Navajo. Part of that was to issue livestock permits. Livestock permits initially went to men. The good men knew that you automatically hand it over to your wife, one of your wives, and then the permit passed through her children. But these were meant to create nuclear families. Okay, so today, when my mom passed away, my mom's livestock permit, which was from her mother, we agreed to give to my younger sister. That leaves me and my sisters and my children possibly without a place. Okay, so it's a form of dispossession, it's a form of dislocation, it's part of the scattering into border towns in search of wage economy. And this is what I want my people to think about. Okay, so this comes up constantly. Okay, so here's the livestock reductions regulations, which is 1956. We continue to live by these. This is the legacy of the livestock reduction. Is the way land use is determined. It's really hard to change. People think that their livestock permits were brought. God gave them to Moses, and then they gave them to people. Like, you just can't even talk about them. Okay. So this is Eugene So. When I talked to Eugene So, was on one of our livestock panels that we did the year while we were putting together the exhibition. To hear this in Diné is just so profound. It's so beautiful that the English language can never capture what he tells me in Navajo. He says land doesn't mean land. Land means your footprint. It means your footprint and where your ancestors have walked before you. You know, it's just beautiful. And so I had those kinds of opportunities. There's a bunch of interviews here in the 40s and 40s that Kimball took, and you see a divide between the old elder Navajo people who are bitter about livestock reduction, and you see the younger people who have access to wage, to education, saying, well, livestock reduction wasn't really that bad. You know, our new sheet is education. Okay, so you clearly see a delineation there. I'm up. So a couple of things that I just want to share is that part of my collaborative research project was to document and to make clearer, I think, for my own people, just what resistance looked like, refusal looked like. So Ramona Emerson, who's a very well-known filmmaker and now Navajo horror novelist, she's a great writer and filmmaker. We went to Tisnazbas one day in July. We met with the family whose ancestors had resisted. They took the range rider, I forgot what the other guy's called, the extension officer or whatever he was called, hostage. The extension officer's wife just happened to be there, so they took all three of them hostage. Okay, they beat the two men, and then they escaped. They were captured, and they ultimately served prison time. Okay, so the amount of violence and coercion and intimidation that was used to coerce Navajos into accepting livestock was not different, and they equated to the violence that was exhibited to them during the long walk of the 1860s, 1863. Okay, Navajo people make those connections. So here we are with the family who shared stories with us. And I'm going to share just one other thing is Navajo language, the Nebazad, is really important. You have to hear it connects you to the land and to relations in ways that the English language just can't. And so for the exhibition in Winter Rock, I had Taft Black Horse. Here he is at Chaco. And here he is, Ramona is putting his mic on because he translated Navajo Council delegates' a statement from the 1947 for the exhibition. And so he reads it in Navajo. And so Gray Eyes, in his statement, he says, my own people have turned against me. He says they don't remember our kinship because of Collier's policies. You know, and some people say, well, you know, that film that you made that's 11 minutes is too long. People aren't going to sit there. Taft Black Horse's reading in Navajo is 19 minutes. And so people aren't going to sit there for 19 minutes. I'm like, I don't care. I want people to hear our language in our spaces. Some people will sit there and just savor it and listen it and to appreciate it. You know? And so that's why I put those in the exhibition. So I think what I want to do is just share with you. Okay, so I just want to share a couple of things with you. Just a few minutes. This is the film I was talking to Ramona Emerson this morning, and I said, you made the first short film of the livestock reduction of refusal and resistance. This hasn't been done for quite a while. I said, you should show it in those film festivals for short films. She said, really? So let me go ahead and, let's see. I'm just going to play a few minutes of this. We are driving up to the homestead of the late Marie Claude Tomchi and James Tomchi in Tisnaspas, Arizona, to meet Lucinda Marie Tomchi and Chris Yazzie. Lucinda lives here, and she and Chris are sharing stories about their ancestors' resistance to John Collier's livestock reduction policies. On January 19, 1945, a group of Tisnaspas residents, including Lucinda's and Chris's grandparents, visited the district supervisor and the range rider, who were enforcing livestock reductions by limiting the numbers of sheep, goats, and horses allowed on issued permits. They had one message for the enforcers: stop taking our sheep. What happened when they asked the district supervisor to allow them to keep favorite animals, and his refusal led to his abduction, his wife's, and the range riders. For the Diné, a message of what happened if they resisted. The Diné, including Ba and Slocum Claw, took their captives with them. The men had fashioned clubs made from cottonwood and beat the supervisor and the range rider with them. The tribal police from Shiprock came and gave chase. Some of the men, including Capitan Benali, confronted the police, who then reversed course and fled as the men chased them. The Tisnaspas residents eventually surrendered. 15 people were arrested, 8 were freed, including Ba Claw and Eloise Benali. Eloise had held the horses while her relatives confronted the government workers. 8 of those charged, including Ba and Eloise, were freed. 7 were convicted in a Prescott court. 5 were sentenced to a year in jail. Moses Claw, who was on leave from the army, served 14 months. Capitan Benali, who also served 14 months, had 2 sons who were code talkers and in the South Pacific at the time. Telling these stories reminds us that the Diné felt wronged by the government policies and that they felt deeply about livestock reduction.
So in some of these stories that we have, my mom, where the front of Chris's vehicle is, the red one, that's where my mom was born.
My name is Lucinda Tomchi. Hi
there, Shay Chris Yazzie and shit. Ashiinchly, but Anieda Shitche. 8,000 inchly.
So what we have present day are grazing permits in order to have, to show the amount of sheep that you have. We have our grazing officials today who are hired to handle that process. But at that time, it was actually a BIA agent that was the person who handled all the permits for grazing holders. At that time, my grandpa, Slocum Claw, had been told he was overgrazing and they needed to reduce it. He had already reduced it to an amount, had told them that, he complied with what they had asked for, but what happened was they wanted more, and it went down to 85, and they felt like they had already eliminated what they could, and it was their livelihood that was at stake.
There was another kind of major person in the incident, which was a man by the name of Capitan Benali. He was kind of the muscle behind the whole incident and in helping to secure the Indian service agent and his wife. And then also he had an altercation with the Navajo police where he actually took a gun away from one of the Navajo police officers as they had chased him down and then had kind of turned the tables on the night. And fortunately, it just ended in kind of a Mexican standoff because they held their guns for a while and then cooler heads prevailed. And I think it's just a reflection of the passion that they had for, their livelihood, which was raising sheep. Sheep were actually more of a form of currency as well back in those days. A family's wealth was determined by the number of the sheep they had. For the Indian service agent to order that, Slocum and Baugh had to reduce their herd by another 85 sheep was just too much. And I think there were other Navajos. I know there were other Navajos across the reservation that were really struggling with the Herd Reduction Act, and there's really no pictures out there to verify the slaughtering, the forcing of the selling of the sheep and things like that to confirm all that the Navajos were put through after they had been advised to become sheep herders and rancher farmers. My grandfather's name was Cowboy Diné Sosi, and he was the older brother of Ba Claw, who was Slocum Claw's wife. And my great-grandfather, which would have been Ba and Cowboy's father, and also Eloise Benali, which was Capitan Benali's wife. He was the father of all of them. He was the patriarch of the family. He was also a silversmith. He was a medicine man, and also a very prominent rancher around here. And my grandfather ended up being arrested in that incident as well, along with my great-grandfather, who was the sitting council delegate here in Tislandspas. And it affected not only their lives, but, generations to come, because, my great-grandfather never really recovered from that as far as his political career. And, even in business, his business was affected by that. Back in those days, if you got arrested for anything, there was a stigma that was attached to you. Some of the times that my mom talked about this incident, it wasn't with great pride or anything like that. It was more like, I felt more like there was some shame associated with it, By the time they came back from being arrested and everything, there was a lot of things had changed. The government really wanted to make sure that there was not going to be a future uprising. So, things were lost, position, status, And my grandfather, as a result of some of that, finished out his life mostly farming. He did a little bit of ranching, but the ranching was just not as prominent as it had been in those days before this incident. I believe that the Livestock Reduction Act was a mistake. The government used it almost as a form of control and intimidation. This is a very, very important event in Navajo history. Most Americans do trust the U.S. government to do the right thing, but I believe that a lot of times the U.S. government has missed the mark in dealing with Native Americans. The resistance that my family showed in standing up to the Herd Reduction Act, I think it's so important because it affected literally just about every family on the reservation, because at that time, raising sheep, ranching, whatever you want to call it, was pretty much the way that families supported themselves. And it was the livelihood of the Navajo Nation at that time. Now that I'm learning more about this incident, I feel like it has instilled in me a sense of pride, and I don't feel shame over this incident. I feel like they did what they had to do to protect their livelihood and their families. It tells me too that, that even coming from a small town like Tislandspas, that if you have a voice and you're willing to stand up for yourself, it doesn't matter where you come from. Even if you are standing up against the most powerful government in the world, you still can make your voice heard. You might pay a price for it like our ancestors did,
I think this is a period that needs to be revived, to be told from the viewpoint of the Diné people, from our families who were impacted, because that never happened. I think back in that day, it was only captured by the agents, who, in perspective, like, of course, like Milton Snow, where he was given that directive to come out and produce, a lot of the the findings or on behalf of the government. Everything was from that government standpoint. And what happened as a result was things were hidden. And our history is lost. Here we are generations later trying to revive it. And how do we do that? All the people are gone, and all we have are documents in which we can look through and share. And it's good for keeping and reviving the culture for the generations to come, so that our grandchildren know where they came from, who their grandparents were, how they fought for the things that were important in their life. And that resonates even today. It just makes it even that much more important to kind of build our relationships with our relatives, because that was lost in all of this. Each generation, I feel, just even my own upbringing, I'm finding that throughout our Navajo people, we're all losing that connection to the past.